Listen, everybody knows that Warhammer 40k is extremely difficult to get into. Because of this, the creators of Warhammer have created a format of Warhammer called Combat Patrol. In Combat Patrol, you build the models in the box, you paint them, and then you go play, which makes everything incredibly easy and simple. The purpose of today's video is to go over Strike Force Octavius, or in other words, the models you see behind me. By the end of this video, you're gonna know how to play this Combat Patrol team so that you'll feel comfortable investing and purchasing this Combat Patrol box so that you can go out and play against your friends. You could purchase this team through purchasing the Leviathan starter box, or you can just straight up buy the Combat Patrol Space Marines with the image that is behind me over here. So we have a group of Flamer models, or models that do fire damage. We have some Terminators. For people that are brand new to the game, Terminators are models that tend to have a high amount of health and a high amount of defense, so it tends to be difficult for your opponents to be able to deal damage to Terminators. And then you also have two Terminator leaders that you can equip with your Terminator squad if you want to give them some type of buff. But the thing is, guys, when you're playing this Combat Patrol team, your toughness or your defense is so high that they're on purpose limiting the amount of models that you're going to be able to use because your models are so tough. So the first model that we're going to go over here, guys, is Captain Octavius. And me being a new player at one point, looking at this stat sheet can look like just a bunch of numbers. So what we're going to do is simplify this into a way where you're just going to look at some specific things so that you know if the model's good or not. First thing we're going to take note of, guys, is that this model has a 5-inch move. And for new players, moving 5 inches is really slow in comparison to other models in the game that have the ability to move 8, 9, 10 inches across the board, which is literally double the amount of movement that this model has. This Combat Patrol team tends to move pretty slowly across the table. Captain Octavius also has a 2+ save, which essentially tells us that we need to roll a 2 on a dice to be able to defend him from taking attacks. When we're talking about defense for new players, the most important thing that you want to take note of is if a model has an invulnerable save. Having a 4+ invulnerable save on this model means that, your opponents are going to have the ability to shoot at your models and to reduce this number of 2 maybe down to a 3, maybe down to a 4, sometimes 5 or 6. But because Captain Octavius has a 4+ invulnerable save, his save can never get any worse than a 4, essentially meaning that you're always going to have, at minimum, a 50% chance to block your opponent's shots. Now, when we look at Captain Octavius's weapons, he has the rapid fire 2 rule, which is something that we're going to go over later. It's actually pretty important. He has a 24-inch range, meaning he can shoot across a table 24 inches. He attacks twice, so you get 2 shots hitting on 2s, so you need to roll a 2 or higher to land your hit. And over here, you're going to notice that this has 1 damage each. So for every shot that you land, is going to be dealing 1 damage. This weapon's going to be good to destroy a bunch of models that have a wound characteristic of 1. Now, Captain Octavius has 6 wounds, so it would take your opponent to land 6 shots with a Stormbolter to remove Captain Octavius from the game, which, let me be real, is not likely to happen. Captain Octavius also has a relic weapon in melee, so when he's dealing melee damage, he's going to be attacking 6 times, needing a 2 or higher on a dice to land the hit. This weapon also has AP -2. And when we talk about AP is the value that's going to reduce this number over here. So if Captain Octavius was attacking into Captain Octavius would reduce that 2+ save down to a 4+ save, because 2 minus the 2 here would then reduce it down to a 4, putting him on his invulnerable save. But the most important thing that we're going to look at over here, or at least what I look at when I'm looking at weapons, is the damage. This relic weapon deals 2 damage when it hits. When we talk about models in Warhammer in general, Orcs have 2 wounds, Space Marines have 2 wounds. A lot of pretty good infantry units tend to have 2 wounds. So So when we notice that we have a weapon that deals 2 damage each time it lands, we know that we need to use that weapon to target Space Marines, to target orcs. We don't really want to be using those weapons to target little monsters that have only 1 wound, because then it feels like we're just wasting some of that damage. We need to make sure we're prioritizing our shots toward the things so that we can maximize our damage values. Captain Octavius also has an ability that says that you get to re-roll charges made for this model's unit, which is something that we're going to go over later. When we take a look at Librarian Tantus, he has that 5-inch move again, so he's pretty slow. 2-up save, 4-up invulnerable save, which is pretty good. He has 5 wounds, which is 1 less wound than Captain Octavius. When we take a look at our Librarian's attack, he has a Smite and a Stormbolter, keeping in mind, new players, that you're going to be able to attack with both. If you're attacking at a model that has a high number of wounds, which means that you're verbally asking your opponent, how many wounds does that model have? What kind of toughness does that model have? Just so you know how tough it is. If it's tough, you're going to use your focused Witchfire, which is going to have a higher strength value, but more importantly, more AP, so that it makes it more likely that the shot lands. And if it's not as tough, you're going to be using just a regular Witchfire, so that you get to keep yourself from taking a hazardous test. If you were to do the focused Witchfire and then fail the hazardous test, which is something you'll understand when you're playing the game, you're going to force your Librarian to take damage upon himself. So our Librarian also has a Force weapon, which is a psychic weapon, which is sometimes relevant. 4 attacks, strength 6, -1 AP, but most importantly, that D3 damage. So if you roll a 1 or a 2 on a dice, that counts as 1 damage. You roll a 3 or a 4, that's going to count as 2 damage. Or if you roll a 5 or a 6, that's going to land as 3 damage. Keeping in mind that this is most likely a model that you're going to want to use to target models with high amounts of wounds, because you don't want to just waste those shots on little things. Next, we have the Infernus Squad, which is a 6-inch movement, still relatively slow, a 3-up save, keeping in mind that there's no invulnerable save here, guys. Like I mentioned earlier, 2 wounds apiece. The Infernus Squad is going to have a bolt pistol and a pyre blaster. Keeping in mind, guys, that there's only a 12-inch range on each of these shots. So this model needs to be up close in order to deal damage. What's most important here is the pyre blaster. The pyre blaster is a torrent weapon, so once you understand the amount of shots you're gonna land, they automatically hit your opponent, because imagine missing when all you're doing is shooting fire at something. Fire is gonna land, it's just fire. There is no AP on this shot, and there are only 1 damage each, so this is the weapon you're gonna prioritize to take out your opponent's models that tend to have 1 wound each. Keeping in mind that these flamers, is what they're generally called, have D6 shots, and you're gonna have 5 models inside your unit. D6 shots means that you're gonna take 5 dice, 1 dice for every model inside that unit, and you're gonna roll all 5 dice. Depending on the numbers you roll, you're gonna get that many shots, or that many shots are gonna land on your opponent automatically. So if I have 5 dice and I roll 5s on all 5 dice, I'm gonna have 25 shots that land on your opponent, which can be absolutely devastating. When we take a look at the melee weapons for this unit, there are 3 attacks each, 1 damage each. This is really not a model. This is a model you want to keep out of melee. You don't really want to be doing melee with this model. Last unit we're going to have here is the Terminator Squad, 5 inches, so he's still pretty slow. Has that 4 invulnerable save that we talked about earlier, which means that this model is going to stay alive for a long time. When we talk about the weapons in the Terminator Squad, you're going to have 1 model equipped with an assault cannon. Well, that model is going to have 6 attacks, going to be landing on 3s, strength 6, 1 damage each. This model does have the devastating wounds keyword, which essentially means that if you go to attack your opponent and you roll a 6 on the wound roll, it's damage that cannot be stopped. It's automatic damage. Your opponent cannot stop that damage unless they have something called a feel no pain, which can be something I'll talk about in another video. 4 of the models are going to be equipped with Stormbolters, which is the same weapon we went over before. Under the melee weapons, we're going to have 4 models that have Power Fists, noticing that these are dealing 2 damage each, so you know where to prioritize those weapons. When we talk about the melee weapons for the Terminator squad, we're going to have 4 models with power fists that deal 2 damage each. So you already know where to prioritize those attacks towards because they are 2 damage each. And we're going to have 1 model with a power weapon that's going to have 1 extra attack, -2 AP, but only 1 damage. The Terminator squad also has an ability that says each time a model in this unit makes an attack that targets your Oath of Moment target, add 1 to the hit roll. That ability is the perfect segue into learning what the Oath of Moment ability is for this combat patrol team. Oath of Moment says at the start of your command phase or at the beginning of your turn, select 1 unit from your opponent's army. Until the start of your next command phase, that enemy unit is your Oath of Moment target. Each time a model with this ability makes an attack that targets your Oath of Moment target, you can re-roll the hit roll. So in other words, every time you go to roll for your attacks, which would in this case would be 2 dice. Let's say I roll 2 dice. Let's say I roll a 1 because I need a 2. I'm gonna have the opportunity to take my dice and roll them again to see if I can roll a 2. Oath of Moment basically makes your models much more consistent at landing shots and having the potential to deal wounds to your opponent's models. Guys, Oath of Moment is very strong. You play this combat patrol team because of Oath of Moment. Captain Octavius is also going to have the opportunity to get 1 of 2 enhancements. An enhancement is basically a buff for that model. A buff makes something better. The buff that I recommend that you choose is going to be called Champion Duelist, which is going to give his melee weapons precision and lethal hits. Lethal hits is going to be the reason why we're choosing that buff, because lethal hits states that whenever you roll a 6 on a dice when you're rolling for your attack dice, that attack technically automatically wounds. So your opponent automatically is going to have to roll dice to save that. And when you're doing that onto your Oath of Moment target, you can literally just roll your dice. You can even roll hits. But if you really want to roll 6s, you can just pick up all your dice again and roll the dice again looking for 6s because of that model potentially being your Oath of Moment target. Only do that when you're fighting against models with a high amount of toughness. So when we talk about tanks and we talk about giant vehicles, that's when you're going to want to be fishing for the 6s with the lethal hits ability. Your combat patrol team is also going to have something called stratagems, which are little abilities that you can activate through various portions of the game that can make your team better. First stratagem that we're going to go over is Gene Wrought Resilience. You're going to use this during your opponent's shooting or fight phase. This is going to target 1 unit in your army, which says until the end of the phase, each time an attack targets your unit, if the strength characteristic of that attack is greater than your unit's toughness characteristic, subtract 1 from the wound roll. In other words, if there's a giant tank shooting at Captain Octavius, you can activate this to make it less likely for that tank to do damage to your model. The next stratagem is Veteran Instincts that you're going to activate during your fight phase. This can only target Terminator units, so the only models you can't use this on is your Infernus Marines. This reads, until the end of the phase, each time a model in your unit makes an attack, re-roll a wound roll of 1. If that attack targets a monster or vehicle unit, you can re-roll the wound roll instead. So I would only activate this ability if my models were fighting a vehicle or a giant monster to make it more likely that I destroy that unit. The last stratagem we have is Duty and Honor, and this is at the end of your command phase or at the end of the beginning of your turn. You can target 1 unit from your army that is within range of an objective marker or within 3 inches of an objective marker. This reads, that objective marker remains under your control even if you have no models within range of it, until your opponent controls it at the start or end of any turn. This stratagem here is super key to you playing and winning with this team because you have a small amount of units, and because you have a small number of units, you may need to leave your objective so that you can go contest other objectives across the battlefield. So by activating Duty and Honor, it makes sure that you get to keep an objective on the battlefield without having to physically be there. Now, generally, you're going to be scoring points by taking objectives, just mentioned. However, we're also going to have one secondary objective, which is something that you can do throughout the game that's going to score you points to win the game. This game is not about killing models. This game is about scoring points. But the default secondary objective that we have over here for your team, which is going to be the one that I recommend you take, which says at the end of each phase, you score 2 VP if your captain model destroyed one or more enemy models that phase. Because it's during each phase, this does not mean that it's only during your turn. You can score those points during your opponent's turn as well. So in other words, if you can get Captain Octavius on your opponent's side of the field, dealing melee damage, and he's in melee combat with your opponent's models, you could take out some of your opponent's models during your turn. Once the turn passes, your opponent's going to be dealing melee damage back to Captain Octavius, which is then, if he's still alive, you're going to be able to deal damage again, and if you take out those models again, you're going to score again. And because Captain Octavius is relatively difficult to remove from the battlefield, it seems like a pretty easy way to score points. Now, how do you play this combat patrol team? Where are you going to be placing your models so that you can effectively win the game even though you have a small number of models in the battle? I'm going to recommend that you take your Infernus Marines and that you place them on the objective that is within your deployment zone, and for the first one or maybe even 2 turns, you keep them in your deployment zone to defend that spot. Because they have flamers, later on in the game, once your Terminators are done shooting and killing things, if they need to move up the board to deal damage to your opponent's models, they can. And because they most likely fought with your Terminators, they're gonna be at a lower amount of health, so that the flamers is gonna be just a really quick and easy way to kind of clean them up because your flamers automatically wound. Because they're a late game cleanup, keep them safe in the back. You'll know when to push them up the board. Keep in mind that once they leave that home objective, activate the stratagem so that you get to keep that objective. What I would then do is take the Terminator squad, so these models over here, these 5, I would just take them and place them right in the center of the board behind cover somewhere so that your opponents are baited to shoot into your Terminators. Your Terminators have 4-up and vulnerable saves, so it's going to be pretty difficult for your opponent to take out your Terminators. Keeping them behind cover so that you have the ability to make your saves just a little bit better, so it's a little bit more difficult for your opponent to take out your Terminators. The point being is that you want your opponent's models to go out into the open so that it's easier for you to land some shots, because our models tend to be incredibly slow. Preferably take those models and keep them within range of the objective in the center of the battlefield so that you have the ability to contest that objective. Generally, when you're playing Warhammer, the person who takes the center objective is the person who's going to win the game. Now, technically, you could take either one of the Terminator captains and add them to the group of Terminators over here, which makes it more difficult for your opponent to remove these models from the battlefield, because they're going to be within this unit, and these models will die before you get to deal damage to one of these models. But because we have such a small amount of models, I'm going to recommend that you start the game with just this on the battlefield and this on the battlefield, and you use these 2 models here as 2 separate dudes on the battlefield. Your captain and your librarian have an ability called Deep Strike. Deep Strike essentially says that during your second turn, you get to take this model and put him down on the battlefield anywhere that is 9 inches away from one of your opponent's models. So your captain can do that, and your librarian can do that as well. Keeping in mind that these models have Storm Bolters with the ability Rapid Fire 2. Rapid Fire 2 essentially says that if you're at least half the distance away from your opponent's models, you're going to add 2 attacks to those shots. So instead of it being 2 attacks, you're going to get 4 attacks. Same thing goes for the librarian over here, Rapid Fire 2. So this basically guarantees that you're going to be getting more shots, keeping in mind that if you deep strike 9 inches away from your Oath of Moment target, now instead of just getting 4 shots between the 2 models on your Oath of Moment, you get 8 shots. And now because it's your Oath of Moment, you get to re-roll your 8 shots. which makes it more likely that we're going to destroy our opponent's models. And keeping in mind, whenever we kill a model with Captain Octavius, we're going to score 2 points at the end of that phase. And the most important thing is that Captain Octavius, that we may have mentioned earlier, he has an ability that says that you get to re-roll charge rolls made for this model's unit. You essentially get 2 chances to roll a 9 or a higher on your dice to land your charge and deal melee damage with your relic weapon that we already know does a ton of damage. Which, when you do damage to something and you kill something, you're going to score 2 points because Captain Octavius scores points when he destroys models. And when you put all of these tactics together and you're playing this combat patrol team, it makes it very likely that you're going to win your game. But most importantly, you're going to have fun because now you have an idea of what you should do when you're playing the game. If you got any value from this video, please like this video. If you want one of your friends to play this combat patrol team, or you know somebody that plays this team, share this video with them. And if you have a combat patrol team that you want to play, that you would like to see a video like this for, leave it in the comment section below. I always say the same thing when I end these videos. Always remember, guys, eat healthy, okay? Work out every single day. And most importantly, you guys got to remember to believe in yourself, right? Peace out, people.